Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. And a very good day. You are tuning to a special interview. It is a radio program by the Institute of Islamic Understanding Malaysia, IKIM, IKIM. And this program is an English talk show that where experts and leaders from various fields share their professional insights and opinions on current and also groundbreaking issues that foster innovative perspectives and solutions. I'm your host, Batrisha Afrina. Alhamdulillah, in today's episode of special interview, I would like to invite you to join me on a journey. And in this journey, I would like to bring you on an understanding of a phenomenon that has been quietly reshaping the narrative of faith, especially in the modern world. And specifically, the topic of today's conversation is the rise of converts among the Western intelligentsia. And over the years, more and more scholars, academics, and also cultural leaders in the West, individuals deeply embedded in secular and philosophical traditions, have found themselves drawn to Islam. So in this special interview, we would like to look at all these questions, where what inspires the embrace of this faith, and also often in the face of societal skepticism, and what role do these converts play in redefining the relationship between religion, identity, and also intellectual discourse. So today, we are privileged to have Dr. Timothy Winter, or better known as Shaykh Abdal Hakim Murad, with us, a globally respected Islamic scholar and also the founder and also Dean of the Cambridge Muslim College, to unpack this question. Assalamualaikum, Shaykh.
Walaikum salam wa rahmatullah.
It is such a pleasure to have you with us today, Shaykh. How are you, Shaykh?
I'm well, thank you. Yes,
Alhamdulillah.
thriving. Always good to be in Malaysia.
Happy to have you with us today, Shaykh. So, Shaykh, I would like to start today's interview with you yourself and reflection, and just self-reflection. Why do you choose Islam, and how has it defined you, or how does it influence the way how you define yourself?
Well, there are many paths up this particular mountain, and we try to discern in our little community in Cambridge, where the mosque officially registers new conversions and issues certificates. And last year we had, I think, 204 conversions in the mosque, and the number is slowly rising by the grace of God. Whether there is a single pattern or one way up this particular mountain. And despite crunching all of the data, it's not really been possible for us to discern yet whether there is a particular profile of English person. We get a wide range of ethnicities. We get more or less 50-50, both genders, a different spectrum of people's educational backgrounds and class backgrounds. It's somewhat bewildering, actually, and no doubt if someone were to write a PhD dissertation on the new Muslims of Cambridge, they would be rapidly puzzled by the absence of any generalization that one could make about people. Have they had a particular disaffecting experience with a previously held religion? Have they perhaps been exposed to a particular Islamic voice? It is very difficult. I would say that, sort of mirroring my own trajectory many years ago, one of the key paths is through the kind of national affection for Islamic art. Because, of course, the Malaysian-sponsored Bukhari Gallery, which is one of the highlights of the British Museum now, is actually the third most popular visitor attraction in the British Museum, after, I think, the Elgin Marbles and the Sutton Hoo Treasure. And if you go into that space, it's always full of people. And they have, exhibits from the Hajj in times gone by. There's Islamic footwear, there's glassware, there's calligraphy, there's textiles, there's ceramics, a kind of general conspectus of the artistic
Islamic
productions
arts.
of Islamic civilization. And we have our own little exhibition space in the mosque in Cambridge. And there is even a website, Cambridge Islamic Art, which is quite populated. So one particular trajectory, and for instance the William Morris Gallery in North London now, which is quite a popular attraction, is currently staging an exhibition on the way in which William Morris, who was at the 19th century's best known and most influential interior decorator in England, was profoundly influenced by Islamic traditions of decoration and design and geometry. So there is a kind of national interest and affection for Islam's decorative and aesthetic and also oral traditions. And following something called the Festival of Islam, which happened in the mid-1970s in London, which was a major event. It was opened by the Queen and kind of high profile. It produced books, and there was an exhibition at the Hayward Gallery. The Tate, I think, staged a special exhibition, and it was the cultural event of the year. That actually triggered the first significant wave of post-World War II conversions in England amongst a certain educated elite that really take aesthetics seriously, and also people who want to see what is the kind of philosophical or theological or metaphysical grounding for that particular aesthetic. Islamic art and architecture, despite their historic and geographic diversity, nonetheless are redolent with a particular worldview, which necessarily requires attention. So at that time, this is a book that influenced me in my kind of journey towards Islam. Titus Burckhart's, or Ibrahim Burckhart's book, The Art of Islam, was a very interesting, rather beautiful coffee table book, which I think is still available, which took a broad conspectus of the arts of the Islamic world, but not from the perspective of a standard history of art academic perspective, but rather from the point of view of the theological, metaphysical underpinnings and the world of the generation of the craft, the asnaf, that could produce this particular Islamic aesthetic. So I think that is one significant channel. If we're talking today about kind of educated intellectuals, and certainly people who are successful in da'wah in the Western context, find that Islamic art is a very good way of beginning to open the door, because beauty is universal. Nobody can argue against it. Yes. It's a very attractive way of beginning the conversation about Islam, modernity, truth, particular cultural narratives. So that was an important part of my own particular journey.
MashaAllah, there was quite touching stories to hear that. And while I was doing research for this interview, I came across with a lecture that was given by you on 1997 to a conference of British converts, where you posited that the dynamism of Islamic culture often stems from the energy of recent converts, speculating that their emergence in the West might herald a revival of the fortunes of a tired Islamic Ummah. So looking back years in the future, do you believe this revival has materialized, particularly with the rise of a Western Muslim intelligentsia? And are there specific challenges or opportunities that you now identify in their role within the global Muslim community?
Well, at the time, I was perhaps referring to the research by Professor Richard Bulliett of Columbia University, who has developed a thesis which proposes that the creative energy and the dynamism of Islamic civilization has tended to exist at what he calls the edges, the peripheries, the new Islamic lands. So after a couple of hundred years, the initiative passed from the Arab heartlands into the hands of Turks, Persians, and then North Indians, West Africans, and then reaches the Nusantara, which also became a very dynamic and creative civilizational space. So it's interesting to speculate on whether, of course, any historical patterns can still be expected to obtain in our post-historical, post-normative age. But if so, it's interesting to reflect on the fact that there does seem to be a certain fluorescence at the moment of Islamic thought, creativity, dynamism in the allegedly diasporic communities of the Islamic West. Whether that represents the new edge, the new periphery, where one expects the kind of thought experiments and the juggling of tradition and modernity to take place, is probably too early to say. Perhaps one factor, which is somewhat new, is that there is so much centralized direction, shall we say, of religious discourse in many of the core Islamic countries now, and so much disillusionment with certain desert literalist fundamentalisms that have precipitated violence and sometimes national collapse, that it is actually easier to be a Muslim thinker, ironically, outside the world of Islam, where there's a certain academic culture of freedom and where certain thought experiments can be floated in ways that perhaps would be culturally, societally, even politically difficult in some of the core Islamic states.
And I'd like to go directly into talking about modernism, right, in the modern days. So usually when we talk about the modernism, it often relates to the conversation of secularism, the separation between the religion and also the governance. And looking at it, secularism frequently claims to be natural, but it shapes the certain norms in ways that may conflict with traditional religious values. So while technological advancements have undeniably improved our quality of life, of course, they've also brought with them modern challenges. It's like a double-edged sword. So in many secular societies, for example, behaviors that were once considered universally sinful, such as public immodesty or interest-based transactions, riba, have become normalized or even celebrated. So what is your thought on this?
Well, I don't think too many philosophers of secularity and of the Enlightenment would claim that it is a neutral space. The fact of its neutrality is itself an onslaught on everything that every human civilization historically held to, which was that normativity, ethics, ceremonial, worship, the family, contract, every aspect of human life was determined by the sacred. And the Enlightenment in the 17th and 18th century emerged as a specifically anti-religious phenomenon. The French Revolution turned Notre Dame, which is currently in the news, of course, into a post-Christian space called a Temple of Reason, and they got rid of everything Christian from that space because they saw modernity as a direct attack on traditional religion. It's anti-clerical. To some extent, you can see that in the legacy of the French Revolution in the modern French state, where any religiously minded craftsmen who were working on the refurbishment of the building were prohibited, and I know some of them, from actually saying that this was an act of worship and an act of service to beauty rather than just a kind of secular production of a Republican museum. So the idea that modernity is necessarily neutral towards religion is not the case, and the great hypermodernist ideologies of the 20th century, such as communism and racial-based fascism, were explicitly anti-religious, holding that Darwin was actually the key to human identity, and that Darwinism pushed humanity either in a communistic direction or a fascistic racial evolutionist direction, neither of which was seen to be commensurate with religion. And both the Nazis and the communists, who were hypermodernists, were extremely hostile to established forms of religion, Islam as well as Christianity, of course.
So looking at it broadly, how does Islam provide answers to the existential and also ethical dilemmas that are often encountered by the Western intelligentsia?
Well, the history of sort of Islamic theology in the West is relatively recent, of course, partly due to the fact that until the early mid-19th century, there were severe legal disabilities attaching to anybody who was not professing the Christian religion of the state. In the larger historical perspective, of course, there have been sort of famous British Muslims way back at the time of the Crusade. You think of Sir Robert of St Albans, who's a kind of Islamic superhero who was a Crusader knight from the Templars who converted to Islam and joined Salah ad-Din and was responsible for one flank of his army in the Battle of Hittin, and hence contributed to the recapture of Jerusalem. So our history as British Muslims goes back at least 800 years. There's also Thomas Keith, who we're very fond of, who in the 18th century was the Ottoman governor of Medina and was originally from Scotland, but became Muslim and led the Ottoman army in their campaign against the Wahhabis. Eventually the Wahhabis killed him, but is still regarded as a kind of hero in our heritage. But those were not really thinkers or intellectuals. Those were, if you like, men of action, soldiers. So the actual deep roots of serious thinking about Islam amongst Muslims in Europe probably doesn't predate somebody like Ibn Agueli, who is the Swedish Muslim, although he wrote mainly in French, who converted and became Abdal Hadi al-Aqili, Shaykh Abdal Hadi al-Aqili, studied in Egypt and in India, whose books and whose essays primarily are now being done into English and are having a kind of rather belated impact, and who was the first to formulate some of the deeper questions about what it means to be a member of the European narrative, but also to be authentically embedded in the Sunni traditions of normative Islam. He was the direct disciple of some very distinguished sheikhs in Cairo and was taken quite seriously by them. And from him come a number of other Western thinkers, leading up to more recent people like Michel Valson, who's quite influential in the French-speaking world in particular, and also Charles-André Gillis, who is still alive, who's written some quite interesting theological reflections on the meaning of being Muslim in the modern West, which are not kind of zero-sum game identity preoccupations, but rather looking at the deeper questions of what is specific about the Islamic narrative, the Islamic worldview, the Islamic take on human nature that challenges or perhaps enriches the Enlightenment anti-religious discourses that are intrinsic to the modern world. So his writing also has had a considerable impact, and you can see his isnad, if you like, going back to Ivan Agueli, and Agueli was really the great pioneer, the first significant intellectual, I would say, to convert to Islam in modern times in either North America or in Europe.
And as we are reaching the end of this conversation, I would like to leave you with one last question. Why do you foresee a continued rise in conversions among Western demographics, particularly as modern society nowadays, it seems appear that increasingly desperate to escape certain, I would say, existential struggles in search of a true purpose in life and also a path to lasting happiness?
Well, there is what some philosophers like John Gray will call a fatigue of secularity. The idea that the excitement of discovering a world in which nothing is meaningful, which energized much of the modern and the postmodern project, is wearing off, and people are becoming exhausted, disillusioned, anxious. There's a depression epidemic now in Western countries, which is not unrelated to the draining of meaning from the events of people's lives. And it may well be that as Muslims start to become more mature discursively in the Western space, they will understand that the way in which to make potentially very significant demographic inroads. So in England, for instance, 1 in every 600 British people is a convert to Islam now. The numbers are, we're not an insignificant part of the British Ummah. The last census 3 years ago indicated that 10% of British Muslims actually self-identify as white. So they tick the box saying white European, white Anglo-Saxon, but also the Muslim box. So we can quantify it quite accurately. But the Muslims who come to the West have to excel aesthetically. They have to push the question of Islamic art, which is generally the best way of getting in the door. They have to make sure that they are themselves beautiful people. And they have to explain that Islam has a great intellectual tradition, rather than being the kind of desert fundamentalism that so many of the journalists assume that it has to be.
Yes, and as I usually say, that we are ourselves the ambassador of our own religion. The people learn about our religion through ourselves, not through, I would say, some lecture on the internet or through books, perhaps. And as we are reaching the end of this conversation, I would like to thank you for your, I would say, inspiring insights onto this conversation. And for our dear listeners, for the past 20 minutes, we have listened to Shaykh Hakim Murad in sharing about spiritual and also intellectual forces that drive this trend and its impact on the global Muslim Ummah and also to the Western society. And if you look at it all in generally, that all this, that we are reminded of the profound ways in which faith transcends cultural and also intellectual boundaries, and these converts embody the universality of Islam and its ability to provide answers to the pressing existential questions of modern life. And again, Shaykh, thank you for being with us in the studio. Assalamu alaikum.
Walaikum salam wa rahmatullah.
And to our audience, thank you very much for listening to us today. So if you have some comments or would like to share your thoughts onto this conversation, you can leave it on the comment section. So be sure to link to us for the next episode, and we have more with you. So stay tuned to IKIM FM, Inspirasi Utama Anda.